This interview of Charles Hartshorne by John Cobb was taped in the fall of 1983. We joined the conversation in the middle of a discussion of materialism and the relation between science and religious belief.
The crucial question is not whether everything has a physical aspect, but whether some things have only a physical aspect, like sticks and stones and rocks and so on. And that's the issue that Leibniz was the first philosopher in all the world, it's not even in Asia, the first philosopher to be sharply clear about that issue. The question is whether there is such a thing as mere, dead, insentient matter, in which there's no feeling, no intrinsic value, no memories, no hopes and fears, no emotions, and no thoughts. How do you know this? This is a merely negative statement. There's nothing positive in it that my psychicalism couldn't accept. So I maintain that this is erecting a mere negation into, as though it were a matter of positive information. They don't know that atoms have no feelings. That's not a question any physicist ever discusses as a physicist. How can you claim to have settled it if nobody's discussing it? No psychologist is discussing it either. How many psychologists are discussing whether atoms have feelings? They hardly even discuss whether fish have feelings. They're not even much interested in that. So it's a matter that no scientist has discussed even. How can it have settled it?
Well, since these things have not been sort of argued, would you say that the reasons for the resistance to the emphases that you are giving must be historically understood rather than in terms of arguments?
Well, there's several factors. Leibniz said himself, it won't do much for physics to accept his doctrine that every monad has feelings. That won't tell the physicists much. But it'll do something for theology, metaphysics, ethics, maybe aesthetics. He was absolutely right. Now, there are some physicists today, there are quite a few natural scientists who are psychicalists. According to a Frenchman that came to this country and studied the matter, his view is like a vague Whiteheadianism. Raymond Ruyer, R-U-Y-E-R. He came to this country to see how many American scientists had any ideas like this. He said there are thousands, and they form a sort of an unorganized group that are aware of each other, but they don't want to advertise this because it's not a very popular view, and they're afraid it'll damage their reputations professionally or something. He says there are thousands of them. And Sewell Wright is probably the most famous scientist that certainly holds this view. For Sewell Wright, there's no such thing as mere dead matter. There's nothing but mind in his view, in some more or less radically non-human form of mind. He also thinks that absolute determinism is false, and that in fact, I've heard him say flatly, and you have too, I think, there is nothing but freedom. That's exactly my position. There is nothing but freedom. So this is not a question that science is about to settle, not at all. There's no consensus in science, and there's no sign there's ever going to be. I don't see how there ever can be.
But if among scientists there's more and more openness in this direction, do you think that might spill over into philosophy someday?
Well, there's some openness in philosophy. Another aspect of the matter is that to say that atoms have feeling is a kind of a challenge. How would you imagine these feelings? Well, now maybe we can't imagine it. And I think that psychicalism brings us face to face with human limitations in a way that materialism doesn't. Materialism says there's nothing more to know about the atom except what the kind of thing the physicist is finding out. There's nothing more to be known. So that's really, in a way, it's a kind of a relaxation. We're not going to bother about anything with the question of whether atoms have feelings. It's not worth bothering about. If they have feelings, then that suggests we ought to have a psychology of atoms, and how much can you do with that? Now, I think that maybe it just seems simple-minded. I think the basic human limitation just is you don't know what it would be like to be an atom or to be a fish or even to be a chimpanzee. That we never know exactly what it would be like to be that other sort of creature, what it would feel like, and so on. So I think that in psychicalism we're facing our human limitations, and I think the other fellows are running away from it. They want to think they can just about know what an atom is without, in purely spatio-temporal causal terms. I think Sewell Wright sees that issue exactly as I do. He doesn't see God as I do. That he has trouble there, and I can see why. But apart from God, Sewell Wright and I see the thing exactly the same way.
But would you say that there is a continuity between seeing the world this way and the way in which you think of God?
Absolutely. Leibniz already saw the most obviously consistent way to be a theist is to be a psychicalist. If you admit mere dead matter, then you have theological problems that otherwise wouldn't arise. How does God relate to a lump of dead matter? He can't sympathize with it. In what sense can he understand it? And in fact, how does God influence a lump of dead matter? Why should a mere matter care about what God wants or thinks? Whereas if even the atom has some feeling, then the feelings of the atom may be sensitive to God's feelings or thoughts. But how can a mere matter be sensitive to what God thinks or feels? And if you define God as essentially love, how can God love an atom? Thomas Aquinas was embarrassed by that. How does God love the physical things? Well, he loves them as useful for the creatures that do have intrinsic values. Well, I think that's a sort of a makeshift solution. But he saw the problem. You can't help it. Well, Leibniz saw the problem, thought he would solve it.
If you think of the objects of the natural world as being merely objects or merely material, then that goes with a particular notion of power and omnipotence, doesn't it?
Yeah. Of course, God could absolutely control the atoms. That's no indignity for the atom to be absolutely controlled. But if the atom has to make its own decisions, if it has to feel its own feelings for them to exist at all, how can God will feelings into something else? There's no analogy between that and pushing a button and making something happen.
So in your critique of omnipotence, it's bound up with this psychicalist view of the nature of reality.
Well, that certainly is quite central. Of course, the standard notion of omnipotence puts you in the middle of the strongest possible form of the atheistic argument from evil. Whatever happens that seems unfortunate, well, you have to decide that from God's point of view, it wasn't really unfortunate. It was something that ought to have happened. But if all the bad things ought to have happened, what does it sense to make to call them bad? I think it just confuses everything. To suppose that whatever happens, God decides that just that will happen. I don't think we have a single concept that makes sense then. Not one.
Very often the argument is that God could make things happen, but that he holds back in order to make a space for creaturely freedom.
And that's another compromise that I think is a weak compromise. Yes, God could completely determine everything, but he decides not to. No, I don't believe that's the real solution. I think that's just an ad hoc solution. It doesn't really get to the bottom of the thing. I think you have to say that to have creatures at all is to have free creatures, that's a redundancy. A creature is another will besides the divine will. And you mustn't have the divine will make all the volitions, simply make the volitions of the others. My volitions my decisions I have to make, they're not really mine. I think the whole issue of pluralism, of there being any genuine pluralism, is a question of whether there's a multiplicity of free agents. The Socinians saw that in about 1600. Nobody paid any attention. Various people have seen it for the last 3 or 4 centuries. But the majority just didn't want to see it. I think you have to say that you have to define a creature as a form of freedom that is not divine freedom, but is still its freedom. That's what Whitehead means by creativity as the ultimate category. It's precisely what he means. But the Socinians already had the principles as far as human beings are concerned, but what did they do about the other animals? I don't know. I don't think they did much. And Lequet in France, who knew about Socinus, had the same view about human beings. What did he do with the other animals? I don't think he knew what to do. That's where I think changes in science have helped. When science becomes less rigorously deterministic, I think that helps a lot. A lot of people say, well, the freedom of the atom isn't our freedom. Of course not. But once you admit that there's some genuine freedom, that determinism isn't the absolute truth, then you've opened the door to various possibilities.
In spite of the fact that what you say makes a great deal of sense to me, and I often find people have difficulty in formulating clear arguments against it, I'm sure you found, as I found, that there's just enormous resistance to this kind of shift of views with respect to the nature of divine powers.
Well, I sometimes think that I really ought to write another book on the history of philosophy. I begin to see dimly that whereas I used to think that the history of ideas is the most fantastically improbable thing. Why should people ever have thought the way they did? I'm beginning to see you can roughly explain some of these things. Why people should have spent 2,000 years on a certain wrong track, for example. I think it's partly that they were groping for simplicity. The simplest view of causality is the deterministic view, that the cause simply determines what happens. The minute you start to qualify that, it's going to be less simple. And then you have to decide how much to qualify it, how far short of the absolute determinism you're going to be. But I think that's one of the many cases where extreme simplicity is not at all the same as truth, but is pretty much the same as error. And I admire Whitehead for his epigram. If he'd only done this one thing, I would suspect he was a genius. Seek simplicity and mistrust it. That's a stroke of genius. Well, they did seek simplicity, and for 2,000 years they took the simplest view of causality, and they don't want to give it up. Look how much more complicated quantum physics is than Newtonian physics. Most anybody can offhand almost understand Newtonian physics, but try to look into quantum physics, see if you can understand it. That's hard.
Do you think there are religious reasons also for holding on to the idea of the omnipotence of God?
Well, it's a kind of search for absolute security. Nothing could possibly go wrong at all because absolute wisdom and absolute power is in charge of everything. So that makes everything seem perfectly safe. Only trouble is you still have to go on dealing with dangers. So the security is not what it pretends to be, really. And of course, in terms of process philosophy, even God, in a sense, has something to lose if these dangers are realized, not just we. I'm delighted that I'd a little bit forgotten. I knew that Whitehead had said that God is the, let's see, God is the fellow sufferer who understands. But I'd forgotten he said God is the ideal companion. You put those together, even God has something to lose if things go wrong. Now, Berchayev had said those things just as clearly as Whitehead. I don't know how many, I keep hammering at that because I think it's interesting that entirely independently this Russian, everything in his background different from Whitehead's, came to that conclusion. Berchayev puts it very clearly that God suffers with our sufferings. That's part of his solution to the problem of evil, that God isn't just a calm spectator of our sufferings. He participates in them.
Some people would say that's rather clear in the New Testament account of the cross of Christ, but
of course,
nevertheless the conclusions weren't always drawn that way.
Extraordinary. The cross is if there is a supreme symbol, that would be it. They didn't use it. There was
those who did were declared heretical.
Yeah, there was a heresy of patripassionism. I looked them up with some enthusiasm and thought maybe I'd find myself at home with them. Then I found that they combined that with one or two other ideas which I thought were rather monstrous. I've forgotten what they were.
So it may be that some of those connections were more the reason they were rejected than the...
Yeah, I think so. As far as I've looked into heresies, they usually combine something else. When I was in Japan, there are a lot of Japanese religions. Oh, they have hundreds. And in every one, I'm about to convince there's some one good idea, but there's always something else that's not so good. I think that's true of all the American religions. Mormonism, some wonderful ideas. Christian Science, some good ideas, sure.
I've thought that one of the reasons that the idea of omnipotence in this traditional sense of God being at least capable of making everything conform to God's final purpose,
Yeah.
one of the reasons that was so strong was a deep desire that somehow in the end everything come out right. And I know that eschatological idea is...
Yeah, of course, I think there is a curious paradox. There's a tremendous traditional tendency toward a finite view of God's purpose. There's one far-off divine event toward which the whole creation moves. I say that finitizes God in just the wrong way. God doesn't have a final aim in that sense. Now, the human species may have a final end, but that will be because the human species is one limited item in the universe. It's not the whole story and the whole. But of course, one of the many ways in which philosophers and religious people can differ is that there are some that want the human species to be the last resort, the final thing. I knew an agnostic or atheistic philosopher who couldn't bear the idea of other inhabited planets. He wanted the human species to be the only important thing in the whole vast universe. I don't quite understand this, but I don't think I've ever had such an idea. I would hope that there are species that are better than ours. I would hope there's at least one that's at least somewhat better than we are. But no, I really know a man. I think I know two men, both of them atheists, I think, who couldn't bear that thought. To me, that's very strange. But
well, I think from your own philosophical point of view, or religious point of view, if one doesn't believe in God, then the final center of meaning is almost inevitable.
Yeah, I think so. And one of my favorite ornithologists, Alexander Scutch, he's a non-theistic philosopher, thinker. He's written several philosophical books. He's a non-theist, and like the giants of India, which he knows about, he believes or wants to believe in personal survival of death and an endless progress, personal progress, you see, into higher and higher levels. And I think that he's really trying to divinize human nature in a certain way as a substitute for God. And with the giants, it was explicitly a substitute for God, you might say. We don't need God. We're going to be deified.
But your own conviction is that if you really believe in God, then the question of personal immortality ceases to be very important.
Well, it certainly should no longer have the central position that it's been given. Certainly not. And I never allow myself to forget for long at a time that the ancient Jews could believe in God without worrying in the least about what happened to them after death.
But that doesn't mean that some kind of something like personal immortality is still very important. I mean, if I understand the way in which you think of your relationship to God, there is
I know it seems important to a lot of people. But, and of course, the Asiatics have it with their reincarnation, but they don't regard it as immortality. You go on through many cycles, but if you're lucky, you finally reach a resolution where you don't have to go back and be a limited individual anymore.
But it is important for you, I think, that what we do here and now has a kind of immortality or everlastingness.
Well, sure. I was not clear. This is one way in which Whitehead did a lot for me. His objective immortality of the past and the consequent nature of God. The minute I encountered that, I thought, well, okay, that's where I stand. That suits me perfectly. Yeah, that's right. I use the word contributionism. Every moment, by being what we are, we make a permanent contribution to God. It's a funny thing to me. People thought it was demeaning God to suppose that the world does anything for God. As though we weren't the animal of all the animals who enjoy the spectacle of nature in by far the greatest variety of ways. The fact that a fish is very inferior in some sense to us doesn't mean we can't enjoy knowing about a fish. Well, God can know about everything, all the way down, all the way up. I suppose that doesn't do anything for God. I think it's the most extraordinary thing that anybody could ever suppose that. But you see, they were the victim of words. I doubt if you can find a clearer case of the power of language to imprison us. They defined God verbally as perfect. That's a set of words. Does anybody know what it means to be perfect in that absolute sense? I don't think anybody has anything like a clear idea of what that would be like. What does that mean? What kind of perfection would that be? Would it be perfect knowledge? But it still wouldn't be perfect. You could have perfect knowledge of a very limited thing. Would that be the ideal? No, you want knowledge of a more complex thing, richer in contrast and so on. Well, then would it be perfect knowledge of a perfect world? Well, then you've got two perfections. You have Leibniz's problem of the best possible world, a problem which I think very few would dare to say he'd solved. What would that mean? He tried to define it. It amounts to this. It'd be the greatest possible variety and the greatest possible unity. Well, who knows what the greatest possible variety would be like? Would it be all possible variety? No. On Leibniz's principles, can't be. They're incompossible possibilities. That's a problem that Leibniz set up and absolutely failed to solve. And I think because it has no solution. So then you have a perfect God surveying an imperfect world. Well, does that mean that surveying the world doesn't do anything for God? Then why should he survey it? These are elementary, simple things. You can explain it to a bright child, I think.
More difficult to explain it to a bright philosopher, though, isn't it?
But I think so. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It might well be. We don't know how we're imprisoned in language, and yet even that can be exaggerated, though. The linguistic analysts have managed to exaggerate it, I think. But it is of tremendous power.
One of the criticisms that is often directed to your thought is that you affirm an imperfect God, and I have found that very paradoxical.
Well, but I long ago defined absolute perfection and relative perfection, A perfect and R perfect. And I tried to show in every dimension in which it makes logical sense to talk about absolute perfection, then in those dimensions, God is absolutely perfect. But there are dimensions of value in which it doesn't make sense to talk about an absolute maximum. In those dimensions, God could not be the absolute maximum. What is he then? Well, he is the de facto maximum in any possible world state. God will have intrinsic aesthetic value. It's the aesthetic values which are not, which are incapable of an absolute maximum. In any state of the world, God will have the supreme maximum of value. He will surpass all the other all the entities coexisting with God, all the actualities coexist, and that is true by an absolute necessity in any possible state of the world. That would be true. And it's not hard to explain how that could be. If God's awareness includes all the other forms of awareness, then automatically God will have all the values that the others have, plus the value of synthesizing the others. So God will always be supreme and therefore will always be worthy of worship. And I define religious perfection as that which makes God in any conceivable state of reality superior to all the others. Then all the others can look up to God. There never can be a rival to God, let alone a superior to God.
One of the areas in which we're imprisoned in language is that when we refer to God, we almost have to use a personal pronoun, and that's going to have a gender. And I know you've been thinking about this question, and I'm curious about
I've stopped using masculine pronouns about God. I've really stopped.
I noticed that we both slipped into doing it today.
It's horrible to go back to an essay you wrote way back where you used them very freely. There may be 30 cases in one article. That's awful. But I really have undertaken not to talk that way. It's a bit awkward. I think it's an intrinsic defect of language. There ought to be a third kind of pronoun. There isn't.
Dr. Hartshorne, at this point, began answering questions from the audience, ranging from his doctrine of contributionism to immortality.
I would like Dr. Hartshorne to spell out his doctrine of contributionism somewhat more fully.
It's my reinterpretation of the old idea that the aim of creation is the glory of God, or that our duty to God is to serve God. That the service of God is the basic principle of obligation and of all value. Now, I hold, as Whitehead did, and I might have reached this view without Whitehead since I taught aesthetics for a number of years, but purely by accident. The professor of aesthetics suddenly grew ill, and somebody had to take over the course, so I did. But Whitehead held, and I've long held, that the aim of life is better described in aesthetic terms than any others. The aim of life is the creation of aesthetic value, and the word beauty is not the only word to use about aesthetic value, but beauty is at least the central aesthetic value. Meaning central rather literally, I make a circle in which beauty is a little circle in the middle of a big circle. The sublime is not just the same as the beautiful, but it's related to it. The pretty is not the same as the beautiful, but it's related to it. The value of humor, of jokes, the value of something, the enjoyable value of something ridiculous is an aesthetic value. All those are values that you enjoy just for their own sakes. You don't ask what are the consequences, how useful will it be for this or that future good. Aesthetic value is intrinsic immediate value. Now, I hold that the basic value of the world for God is aesthetic. For God, it is beautiful. And everything we do can add a new enrichment to the beauty of the whole creation. This is Whitehead's view. The aim of all nature is beauty. Now, Whitehead also stresses the word intensity, but that's an essential dimension of aesthetic value. A very tepid experience can't be supremely valuable intrinsically. It has to be intense. And Whitehead holds there's no absolute upper limit to intensity. Now, of course, some intense experiences are painful, but even an intense, painful experience is not totally without value, according to Whitehead, and I agree with that. When there's no value at all, I think we just lose consciousness. So I think there's always some value in experience, and the value of my experience can be communicated to you if you can participate in my experience, if you can be aware of my awareness of something that can contribute value to your awareness. And to me, that we basically serve God by contributing to the divine awareness of the aesthetic value of the world. Now, ethical value can be included in that in two ways. There's a beauty of, well, there's an expression, the beauty of holiness. Now, that's a genuine aesthetic value, I would say. a goodwill, to have a goodwill is intrinsically a value. There's something satisfying about a goodwill, and something dissatisfying about an ill will. So ethical value is partly, directly, a kind of aesthetic value, and also instrumentally, if it's genuine goodness, it will, at least probably, contribute to future aesthetic value. It will make life more richly beautiful for yourself or others. And when there are people who claim to be very good, but who make life ugly for themselves and those around them, you have to be rather suspicious, I think. That's not what real goodness should do.
Thank you.
As a follow-up to that, I would like to ask what function God performs in your worldview. All the values that you talk about, freedom, creation of aesthetic values, and so on, seem to be perfectly realizable without any theistic notion.
Yes. First of all, I hold that without a divine plan for the world order, there'd be no value of any kind for anyone. Nothing. That you can only have value in a coherent world system, something like that. And I do not believe that free creatures can get together and mutually order themselves to constitute a world. There are two possibilities. The creatures just adapt to each other. But I argue you cannot adapt to a chaos. To talk about adaptation is to presuppose that a basic problem of order has been solved. Therefore, you won't solve it that way. Darwinian evolution presupposes a settled order for inanimate nature. Then he explains how creatures can adapt, assuming that basic order. He does not explain that basic order. I don't know any physicist that explains it.
But doesn't that destroy the stronger notion of God that you wanted to?
No. God has the power to order the world. But this is an order for free beings. That means that it's not a rigid absolute order. It's not a deterministic order. It's a rough, approximate, or statistical order at most. And it comes the closest to an absolute order on the lowest levels of freedom. And that's where physics started, and that's why determinism looked plausible in astronomy, where you don't even know the individual atoms or molecules you're dealing with. You only know these big clumps or groups of molecules or atoms or particles. And their individual freedoms are so tiny and slight that they cancel out statistically. So we think there's absolute order. That's one of the ways in which the illusion of determinism got its hold on the human mind. These are not historical mysteries. We know how it happened. People don't seem to realize that. There's nothing older than in recorded time, there's no older idea than determinism, at least 25 centuries old.
Question here from Granville Henry.
But that's only one thing that God does. That's only the beginning. But without that divine ordering, I hold there'd be nothing whatever.
Charles, I recently read an article in Science Digest called The Mind of a Microbe, and it tells about some experiments by Daniel Koshland from the University of California at Berkeley on memory in bacteria. Certain bacteria evidently swim towards chicken soup and away from disinfectant. My question is, how do they do it? In the new test, to answer this, the results seem to suggest that they could distinguish between the amount of solution at one time and the amount at another time. So in other words, they seem to have memory. And this seemed to me to suggest a strikingly Hartshornian idea of apprehension of the past at the lowest levels of life.
I think so. I hold with Whitehead, and here we disagree with Leibniz, I think. Leibniz thought that the lower monads have no memory at all, no sense of the past. But now for Whitehead, all concrete intuition is of the past. There's no concrete intuition of the absolute present. So Whitehead differs from Leibniz there, and I'm inclined to go with Whitehead on that point. In fact, that's a point I owe to Whitehead. I might never have realized without Whitehead that perception and memory both relate us to the past, not the absolute present.
Do you think that this should be considered a confirmation of process thought?
Well, it certainly fits it. Of course, no amount of empirical confirmation is going to settle and in my view, is going to settle an issue as abstract and ultimate as that. I think that in any possible world, that's the way it would be, that the concrete intuitions would have to be retrospective.
Mr. Hartshorne, I wanted to return to your views on contributionism. You said earlier that one reason previous theologians had rejected the idea that human life could make a contribution to God was that it seemed to them to dishonor God. But it occurs to me that a critic of your view might argue that your theory dishonors human life by tying its significance to its contribution to God.
I think it's very possible somebody could say that. I think there is a definite answer. What we contribute to God, not in the way in which a slave contributes to someone by doing some work that will have physical results that the other person will profit by. All we contribute to God is our own realization of good, or the similar realization in others that we influence. It's our own good that we contribute to God. That is, our being happy contributes to the happiness of God, if you want to put it that way. Now, if we don't want to be happy, then that would be against. But if we want to be happy, well, how can we object to that? We benefit God by benefiting ourselves, and only by that, or by benefiting our friends or those we are concerned about or ought to be. All God wants from us is our own good, but that becomes God's good. That's what love means, ideally, I would say. It's the other's good, but just because it's the other's good, it's my good if I love that other person. So I don't see how there can be any conflict with human good. When I was at Harvard, there were two graduate students arguing about theological matters. And one of them was talking all about the humanistic values, the things that we want for ourselves and other people. And the other fellow said, well, the love of God includes all that. To me, that was always the bottom line. He'd said it. I got two things out of graduate students that way. The other was this graduate student said another, oh, you deify natural laws. And I can show you, document the point of view that Nietzsche did exactly that. He dismissed God and deified natural law.
Dr. Hartshorne, you developed a doctrine of analogy in your book, Man's Vision of God. Now you have stated your doctrine of contributionism. I wonder about the relationship between the two doctrines. Many of those who have developed a doctrine of analogy, such as Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth, say nothing about contributionism. They have no doctrine of real analogy, but only an analogy of the terms of prediction. But your statement about aesthetics in conjunction with contributionism makes me think that you are speaking of a real analogy. Could you clarify your position on this?
I'm not sure that I caught every word. What is this analogy? I have two basic analogies for God. One comes from interpersonal relations. Parent, child, teacher, pupil, ruler, citizen, the long list, those are all interpersonal relations. That's one basic set of analogies, and I accept those. Now, the Judaic tradition uses those analogies, interpersonal relations. But there's another analogy in the Greek tradition, Plato's world-soul doctrine. That's the mind-body analogy. Did you mention that a minute ago? Oh, good.
I didn't mention the word, but the organic analogy is your doctrine.
All right. Now, what do our bodily cells contribute to us? I think their most basic contribution is they contribute aesthetic value. Our the sensory fullness of our experience comes from those cells. They contribute their little feelings to our sensory feelings and our emotional feelings. So they're doing for us, what they're doing for us is analogous to what we do for God. But this is their own positive feelings. Now, when we suffer, that means that they have negative feelings. So we participate in their suffering. We also participate in their sense of well-being. And our sense of well-being is basically, and at every moment when we're not badly sick or suffering, we have a basic sense of well-being which comes from the fact that our cells are enjoying life, so to speak. That's our relation to God. I think Plato was even more right than he knew with the world soul. That's a funny thing. That's where one point where Whitehead says the opposite. Says Plato's world soul has been a source of a lot of bad, weak doctrines. I think all he really shows there is that an analogy can be badly used. That's all I can see in that. But that I don't think he shows it all. That Plato is not on the right track there. And if you take Whitehead's definition of prehension and his statement that God physically prehends the world, I think you can see that if God were the world soul, that's what would happen.
Charles, on this point of analogy, one of your other most illustrious students, Schubert Ogden, has been questioning this recently, as you know.
Yes.
Arguing that, well, he's not convinced anymore that one can make the case for panpsychism or psychicalism, and that therefore undercuts your whole doctrine of analogy. Have you had a chance to have any further...
Yeah, I'm not... he had an argument where he thought he refuted me on this, and I swear I couldn't quite get it. Gene Peters couldn't get it either. It's subtle, and I've read it several times. I'm still not sure that I get what the point is exactly.
Okay, we'll send this tape to Schubert and have it.
Professor Hartshorne, you said that any situation with a multiplicity of free agents is a potentially chaotic situation. The early Hebrews to whom you referred perhaps saw creation as involving the bringing of order out of chaos. Would you call your own view an order out of chaos metaphysics?
But you see, I don't take this the way Peirce did. Peirce thought that reality started with practically complete chaos. But there's a little incipient tendency to take habits and to get a little more orderly. This is a self-reinforcing tendency, apparently. Now, I don't believe that's the right tack. Now, Whitehead does a different thing. According to Whitehead, reality is always basically ordered, but no definite order is there forever. God isn't stuck with one set of natural laws for all eternity. Why should he be? There are other laws which might also be good. So it's like the history of art. For a while you have one style of art, and then you've had enough of that, so you have another style of art. So Whitehead has this succession of cosmic epochs, in each of which there are even different laws. That makes more sense to me than Peirce's scheme. But it is order out of chaos in the sense that it's getting free beings who tend to be chaotic. They're bound to be if they're free. There's no way in which you can get together and decide to just exactly agree on everything. Because the next moment the guy has done something that even he didn't foresee. How could you? So there's no way in which free beings can just voluntarily, completely harmonize with each other. They have to take a chance on what the others are going to do. When they make their decisions, they don't quite know what the other will do and how that'll fit with what they decide. So there's an aspect of chaos in the idea of multiple freedom. It's taken philosophers 2,000 years to even begin to face that matter. But Epicurus had virtually stated the idea. One of the things that tickles me to death is that I get one of my principal encouragements from Greek philosophy from the materialists, not from Democritus. He was a determinist. Basically, I think he was a nobler character than Epicurus, but I think Epicurus had this point right, that even the atoms have freedom. Epicurus was convinced that he had freedom. That was a deep conviction of his. All the records agree on that. But since the atoms are fundamental, the freedom must be there too. I think he was absolutely right. But that wasn't a materialistic way of reasoning. Because you can also say, I have feelings, so therefore there must be something like feeling in the atoms if they're fundamental. But he didn't take that step.
I'm wondering if there are not satisfactions or intrinsic rewards that we get out of our commitments that are particularly valuable to us and therefore to God.
If they're valuable to us, they're valuable to God. You know, there's the old question, why should God need our praise? Well, he doesn't, unless we need them. Unless we need to praise God, then God doesn't need to have us praise him. But if we need to be in the posture of praising God, then God, in that sense, needs it, but otherwise not. He doesn't have to be told whether he's good or not, the way people do.
I'd like to return to the question of immortality. You've indicated that for process thought, a notion of subjective immortality is not required for a sense of life's ultimate significance. But I wonder if you believe that process thought allows for such a notion.
Whitehead certainly left the question open himself. I may have some tendency to close it. For me, it's not very open. Of course, Peirce said what a lot of people have thought. I think that we might survive death, and that would not in the least guarantee that we'd survive forever. There could be other things beyond dangers beyond death, for all we know. How would we settle that? Immortality is an enormous proposition going on forever. And I don't personally feel any violent need to go on at all, let alone to go on forever. I find that our task in life is a pretty big task. If we can do that, that's quite something. And if we can't do that, and furthermore, you see, I don't have the feeling that so many have, yeah, but it's not fair because some people have had much better luck than others. I agree, that's true. But according to Whitehead, as I interpret him, and according to Buddhism, as the Buddhists really mean it, the I, you, what I deserve, what you deserve, that's a secondary matter. We're a new reality every moment. The identity between me as a fertilized egg cell and me now, or me as a tiny infant and me now. Santayana even, who doesn't have my kind of philosophy and is not a theist, Santayana makes this point. Said the identity from that egg cell to death, to the grave, but you can call that always the same thing. That's just a very abstract kind of identity. All the concreteness of life is different from that. We make too much fuss about whether I get what I deserve or you get what you deserve. Of course, in human relations, we have to consider questions of fairness. But I don't think they have their metaphysical significance. They don't for me, anyway. A Buddhist tried to argue with me in favor of reincarnation by saying, well, suppose you were born blind. Wouldn't you want some explanation of this apparently very unfair treatment of you? Wouldn't you want to know that in a previous life you may have acted badly and that's what brought this on? I said, that wouldn't make me feel any better. Now I'd feel guilty as well. I just don't see it that way. I don't feel that you have a claim on the universe of that kind. I think to be alive at all is a gift. You haven't done anything to deserve the first moment of life. I don't think we have a claim on the universe. Stephen Crane seemed to have felt that in his poem. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist. However," replied the universe, "the fact does not create in me a sense of obligation." I don't think... I do not believe that the universe is obligated to me. I'm obligated to the universe.
John, you were going on to speak to that point. Yeah, well, I think that the differences are, let's say, religious and existential differences. That I know few people who are as completely satisfied as Charles is in a totally theocentric way of experiencing life. And it does seem to me to be kind of ultimate norm, that finally what we care about is that we give glory to God rather than that we get something out of it. But Nevertheless, I'm not there, and most people are not there, and it seems to me that the possibilities of a normal and genuine desire for death not to be the end it's just part of the way most of us are, and I take it very seriously. And it seems to me process thought leaves the fact completely open, and I think there's a fair amount of evidence. How you read the evidence is another matter, and from my point of view, the resurrection of Jesus is an extremely important part of that evidence. I don't separate it from everything else in some total way. But I think the distinctive feature of process thought has to do at this point with the question of personal identity. And our sense of personal identity is more like the Buddhist than it is like much that has been present in our Christian tradition. And personal identity is not absolute. So the idea of there being an absolutely identical person who perseveres for an infinite time in the future seems to me nightmarish rather than some kind of blessed hope. So a doctrine of immortality in that sense, I think I reject as strongly as Charles does. So some kind of personal continuity, yes, but immortality in that sense of immortality, no. I think that the ideal of more and more full realization of perfection of maturity, or whatever term we're going to use, would be one in which personal identity dims for us in importance, and our unity with others enhances in importance. And so I think my ultimate ideal would be one in which finally the only concern of those occasions of experience would be what they can contribute to God and to others, and through others to God. So finally God becomes the final recipient, and their self-identity with this particular causal chain of events that constitutes my personal identity would simply disappear. So that's for me a rather remote eschatological notion, and I think Charles is already there. I appreciate that, but
But there does seem to be a way to conceive immortality that is theocentric rather than egocentric.
I think so, and I would prefer to think in that direction.
Professor Hartshorne, I'd like you to comment on political theory and specifically some of the social issues we face today, like when we're spending more money on the military than anything else. Many people say that the arms race is the most crucial question for anyone today.
Well, now you raise one of the really terrible questions. But I find it, as so many do, a pretty baffling problem. But I certainly don't see much reason in supposing that a nuclear war could be anything but a catastrophe for anything we believe in, about as much as for anything the Russians believe in. So I think that we need a lot of popular pressure to get an administration which will look at it rather differently than the one we have, myself. And we have to hope that the Russians are wiser than they sometimes seem. We had a refugee from Russia who was pretty high up and ought to know. He said that they just assumed there would be a nuclear war. That's a terribly dismal thing, because Khrushchev seemed to be beyond that. And I'm inclined to think he was. If Brezhnev isn't, that's terribly bad luck. I think we ought to be trying to educate him instead of threatening him.
Well, Professor Hartshorne, let me ask you this. What concepts do you feel within process thought are the most crucial for re-educating ourselves to deal with our social problems?
Well, you see, God could do without the human species, but I don't see any reason to think that wouldn't be a loss to God. At the present state, I don't know that the human species ought to last forever. This planet isn't going to last forever. But it doesn't seem to me that it has exhausted its best possibilities. You'd think there ought to be lots more things we could do. though it's awfully hard to see. Eddington once said, can anybody imagine this earth lasting another 1,000,000 years with the people on it? I think he must have meant the pollution problem, I guess. What would be left? There are some ghastly problems. The shocking thing seems to me to be that in a time when we face these overwhelming community issues, national issues, and global issues, all a lot of people can think about is how to get a kick out of life, or how to get vengeance on somebody they're against, or how to promote their group, regardless if it's cost to any other group. It's fantastic. I think partly as a biologist, we're animals without firm, definite instincts like the other animals. We're in the dangerous position of being born knowing almost nothing about how to live. And so we have to, as Kant said, we have to be a law to ourselves, because there's no law of nature to tell us. And that's the position we've always been in, but technology magnifies the consequences and the dangers. That's one of the things none of the philosophers that told us what technology would do to solve our problems. They forgot to tell us it would also produce new problems and bigger problems.
Seems like a sobering, realistic note to end on. We probably should have had that question before the one on immortality.
Yes.
Time is up, and the Hartshornes need to get a rest before the afternoon. So thank you, Charles and John, very much.